RFK Jr. was on the Full Send podcast today, and one of the topics he talked about was the housing crisis that's affecting young Americans. Now, I'm going to cover this from the perspective of a Canadian because our housing crisis is much worse than it is in America, and it is bad in America, to be clear. But our homes in Canada are actually much more expensive, 25% at least. Sometimes even when you measure it, it's actually more expensive than that, even when you adjust, by the way, for the difference in the US and the Canadian dollar. And our workers here, our population is much less productive on average. We earn about 35% less money on average. So we earn less money, and with that less amount of money, we have to buy homes that are more expensive. Yet America has a housing crisis. So imagine how bad it is in Canada. But we'll watch here, short clip, and then I'm going to react to another short clip, just kind of RFK talking basically for 20 seconds each. Let's start it here.
Yes, in California. It's like what?
That was insane.
Like, are we giving? So we're giving $150,000 to.
And what about all the Americans who need homes?
Well, also, yeah,
my kids.
It's insane because that idea.
Right? And my kids shouldn't be getting that from the government, right? And they have good jobs and stuff, but they can't afford a home. You have a whole.
So that is incredible, right? Your dad is RFK Jr. You have a good job and you can't afford a home. Ridiculous.
Generation of American kids, the first generation in history, who cannot afford a home, and that's going to destroy this country.
What it seems like, it's more nefarious because.
And then I'm going to skip ahead here just right now, actually, to the next part, and then I'll kind of react to what he says as a whole. But one point I want to make here: this needs to be talked about, even though it gets talked about sometimes. Still, way more. When I watch politics, when I watch people in charge of public policy, I still get very upset when people keep talking about climate change. I feel like the boomers, and RFK obviously is an exception to this, but boomers and people just around that generation who own a home and have experienced that home go up sometimes 4 times in value. Like you bought a home for $200,000 30 years ago, and today it's well over $1 million. That's pretty common actually in Canada and the USA. There needs to be a plan, and we need to talk about this every single day. How do we get young people to experience this? Instead, it's like climate change, or we'll talk about foreign wars, or we'll debate over abortion and stuff. It is ridiculous. Young people are getting so screwed over in this aspect, and like this is like the American, the Canadian dream. If you can't own a home, how are you going to build any wealth for yourself? How are you going to retire? It's so ridiculous. The topics that get brought up amongst these like boomer generations, people that are RFK's age, oftentimes are so disconnected from reality, and they're just luxury issues that you can afford to talk about when you have all your basic needs met. And we'll continue on because I'm going to go to the next little part of this video where RFK makes a few more really good points.
There's been all kinds of studies done here in California on the homeless, and the major correlation has nothing to do with drug addiction or mental illness. It is the price of housing.
And so California, I think, is a very good comparable to the major centers of Canada, which it's ridiculous that it's like half of our country, Ontario and British Columbia. The homes are laughably, absurdly expensive. It's a very good comparison because it is the tendency probably to just write at that off or to think that people are homeless because of drug issues or because of mental health issues. And certainly that would be a large part of it. But I make this point in other videos kind of a little earlier in my channel, but if you're living in Toronto and 1-bedroom apartment is $2,500, and say you're trying to make it as an Uber driver, and I'm not trying to say that negatively to Uber drivers because they're great, but we have a completely ridiculous system. You're just so behind in that situation. And RFK makes the point here, I'll let it play, that like if you're in that situation, you're basically one bout of bad luck away from being homeless. And that's certainly part of it. Like there's this pretty heartbreaking interview with this woman from Toronto. Actually, I'm going to pull it up here just so you get the idea of this.
My name's Rebecca. I'm from Toronto, born and raised here. I lost my job during COVID, didn't qualify for the CERB. People say you fall through the cracks, but you really don't. It's like more like a domino effect. Like once you don't qualify for one thing, you don't qualify for any of them. Our families weren't willing or able to help us out. And that seems to be the really big difference between, whether people end up in this situation or not, right, is if you've got family support. We often set up here, we got to be out before the post office opens, we're cooperative with security. We were working, we had normal lives.
Would you want to get back to working? And
Absolutely, yeah.
If people want to help you, how can we find
here?
you?
We're either here by the post office, or we're at the McDonald's up at Yonge and Charles.
So obviously a heartbreaking video there. That's in Toronto, in Canada. And I'm going to finish playing what RFK is talking about here because it's related to what that is or that woman's story is. And then we'll react to both videos at the same time.
Yeah.
People cannot afford homes. And they're in a rental and they have 2 flat tires on their car and they cannot put their hands on the rent and they cannot, they can't repair their car. They can't get to work. They lose their job. They lose their home. And now they're out on the street just because they had a little bit of bad luck. They had an engine light come on. And more than 50% of the people in our country can't put their hands on 500 bucks.
So this is so similar to that story we just watched, that short video of that woman out in the cold there in Toronto.
If they have an emergency. And if you're in that cohort and the engine light comes on in your car, it is the apocalypse.
So that's so powerful. RFK is the best politician I think there is right now, just for the fact he's actually obviously cares and obviously is at least talking about these issues. So many politicians, and RFK makes this point as well, in America, there's so much debate over abortion. And I'm not saying that should not be an issue that gets discussed, but it gets talked about so much. There are so many serious economic problems. Like this woman, that woman in Toronto, again, it's not like the country that RFK was running for president for, but similar culture, similar country. Just ridiculous that her story there, she lost her job during COVID and could not apply for these benefits or whatever happened. And then she, even to her words, said a lot of what happens in these situations are, if you don't have family support when something like this happens, then you end up on the street. It's totally unacceptable. The fact that a lot of these problems are economic, are the way that in Toronto, you just can't afford not to have a job or have income for a month because it's so expensive there to live. There are stories of people packing into these places, living in bunk beds. There's one incredible post online of somebody renting out the side of their bed. So they take one half of the bed, you get the other half of the bed. Or there's a bunch of students living in tents. They go to school, international students, and then they live in tents just off the side of the boulevard. They're not drug addicted people. They just can't afford to live. And at least RFK is bringing this up. I just can't believe more politicians don't talk about this.
You're going to be on the street. And that's what happened. The correlation, you look at the place where there's homelessness in our country, and it's always places where there's high housing costs. California has the highest housing costs. And, that's...
It's so simple. It's so, in that way, just if you pick someone in southern British Columbia who is homeless and you say, okay, get your life together, you help them, whatever. Okay, now go off into the world. You get this job as a dishwasher or something. You can't afford to live. It's so unfair. It's so ridiculous. It's so bad for the country. It's so irresponsible that our country has this massive problem happening, and people discuss fossil fuel and what's that going to do in the world 50 years from now. How about dealing with the crazy problems we have right now? As RFK said there, if something like that happens to you in your life, it is the apocalypse to you. Yet we have all these selfish and greedy politicians talking about luxury issues all the time. It makes me obviously very upset. All right, now I just skipped ahead to the last part of the video, and this is more of a continuation of RFK's first point, where he talks about how his children went to good schools, have good jobs, and even they cannot afford homes. So this is the final point I'll make here in the video, just about what RFK says here.
You got to fix that
Does that surprise you, though?
No, it doesn't, because that's my kids' generation. I see what they're doing, what's happening to them. I see how unfair, how screwed they're getting, where they're the ones who are going to pay the $35 trillion debt.
Yeah.
My kids...
It is so crazy how the boomer generation doesn't talk about this every single day. They'll go on with these, like, talk all day about foreign conflicts and still things that if you look at them one by one, you can say, fine, talk about that sometimes, but total neglect for the situation economically you put the younger generation in. Homes that are, like in Canada, in Ontario, our biggest province, growing up, the younger generation, like the generation that's around RFK's age, took 5 years to save up for a down payment. Now it takes over 20 years. So it's essentially impossible. There's all these statistics about how in Canada you won't be able to afford a home until you're in your 80s in many cases. Like there's only affordable homes in very small areas of Canada. And generally, if you're not from there, you're gonna have to try to find a job there. It's a tough go. It's like certain prairie provinces, because even those are getting too expensive. People are moving to Calgary, Edmonton, Atlantic, Canada to try to flee the expensive housing of BC and Ontario. The situation is totally out of control, and you still don't hear nearly enough panic about this. We should be building homes like crazy, and it's ridiculous.
Best schools, they have great jobs, and none of them can afford a home. And
isn't that crazy? Their dad is RFK Jr., a Kennedy, went to great schools, have good jobs, still can't afford homes. That's the situation in much of Canada. Unbelievable. And if, like, similar to that story about how that woman was homeless, like, this is just, that would be a little bit more of an extreme example from what I'm about to say, because it's still brutal though. Like in Canada, in a lot of cases, if you don't have rich relatives, it's in some capacity, you're just never going to own a home. And unless you can figure out a way to be an incredible earner, like very early on, by the way, too, in your career, because it's not that helpful for your life if you can only afford a home when you're 57 years old. I mean, it's better than nothing, but throughout your entire life, you're going to want to own a home before you're a senior citizen.
you know, and their friends are not going, their friends are still living at home with their parents, and these are kids from Harvard and Stanford.
Yeah.
Isn't that incredible? And again, the situation in Canada, in general, other than the exceptions, is actually worse than it is in America. We have a way smaller GDP per capita, and that's been a trend that's been accelerating in recent 10, 20 years, even worse. Canada barely grows its GDP, which is obviously sad and not talked about nearly enough. And the housing crisis has just continually ballooned, totally out of control. The average home in Canada right now is still around $700,000, and you don't have the rock bottom zero interest rates that you had that were like between 08 and around 2021, roughly. That was like, the homes were going up through there, but at least you had a really good mortgage rate. You get a 30-year rate at an incredible discount relative to average interest rates. Now you're paying more of a normal interest rate. It's completely out of control. Most people that earn an average salary are just never going to own a home unless you have rich parents, or rich someone, an uncle, something.
It's crazy.
And I'm thinking about kids, you know, who don't have that or who don't have any college education, and how lost this generation is, how just abandoned they've been by our generation, and then they've all been poisoned.
Right.
And then when he talks about poison, just for context, he's talking about the food, the stuff, like the negative stuff that is put in all the processed food today. But at least RFK admits it. The younger generation has been abandoned. And in individual cases, like if your family is going to support you through, say they get you like an expensive education or what have you, there are ways in the micro economy that this can be fixed. But for the country as a whole, you cannot do this. You cannot think that every little person is going to be the exception to the rule. I feel like this is the cope, or the way that these boomers must justify in their head. I'm just guessing. Oh, well, just work harder. Just be the exception to the rule. Work 3 jobs. Start an online business. Start a tech company. You need a policy for the averages of a country. It's just the way it works. If 3 people do really well in an economy, 3 people by definition are going to be below average. That doesn't mean that they're not willing to work 40 hours a week. Doesn't mean they're not good people. Doesn't mean they're not working hard. Not everyone's skills are going to match up perfectly in a market economy, and that's fine. You still want capitalism, for sure, but something has to be done about how ridiculously unfair the average person who's in the younger generation is being taken advantage of and the situation they're walking into. Ridiculously high homes, have to pay off all this debt. Unbelievable. You have an iPhone, though. You get an iPhone in your pocket. Great. So, anyway, with that said, that's the end of the video. Let me know your thoughts, please, in the comments. Thank you for watching. Have a great day.